Hey History Heroes! I'm Tempest, a historian and museum interpretation expert, and today we're going to be exploring the lives of three queer historical figures whose identities were not only accepted by their societies, but actively encouraged by them. What were their identities, and how did they come out? And what led to their societies accepting them when other regions and countries in the same time period did not? Let's begin our journey in the 17th century and meet Thomas, or Thomasin Hall. Thomasin Hall was born around 1603 in Newcastle upon Tyne, England, and was given the traditional female name Thomasin. They were raised female by their parents, and at the age of 12, they were sent to live with their aunt in London. This gave Thomasin a new sense of freedom and confidence. It also exposed them to a much wider variety of people, and exposed her to more of the world, which would have certainly expanded her viewpoint. It was at this time she would also refine her skills in needlework and crafting bone lace, which she was particularly skilled at. However, in 1625, she abandoned her female identity, cutting her hair short, styling it like a stereotypical man, and putting on clothing usually worn by men. This was because her brother had joined the military to fight in the Anglo-Spanish War that had recently begun, and either wishing to join him or take his place, she began military service and began going by the name Thomas. Then, in 1627, she left the service and settled in Plymouth, England as a woman, once again going by the name Thomasin and wearing women's clothing. But life probably got monotonous, and the money from their needlework probably wasn't good enough. Around 1628, they once again took on a man's identity and signed a contract with the name Thomas to become an indentured servant in America. This meant he could work for his employer for a predetermined amount of time in exchange for passage to the New World, food, clothing, and shelter. When he arrived in Jamestown, Virginia, he was meant to work for John Tyos on his small tobacco plantation. But perhaps due to the reluctance to perform the rigorous labor, or him learning how scarce and therefore valued women's work was, he changed into women's clothing and began presenting as a woman, though occasionally still presented as a man. Trouble started when she was arrested for receiving stolen goods, which she and John Tyos and his wife Jane received, knowing they were stolen from a neighbor, as they had reportedly encouraged someone to steal from them and sell the goods exclusively to the Tyos household. This tarnished Thomasin's reputation and may have emboldened the local community to start openly discussing her gender-bending habits. In particular, one neighbor accused Thomasin of being both a man and a woman, and of engaging in sexual intercourse with a female servant from another household. He encouraged the married women of the nearby settlements to inspect Thomasin to determine the truth, as the law allowed them to inspect Thomasin's body if it was evidence for a legal case. They determined Thomasin was biologically male. Thomasin's employer, John Tyos, swore that she was a man, which led to confusion when a nearby neighbor, John Atkins, wanted to acquire Thomasin's contract. The neighbor went to a local commander, Nathaniel Bass, who had more authority on the matter, and the commander asked Thomasin what her gender was. Thomasin replied that she was both, and possessed a small piece of flesh the size of the top of a pinky, which they called a man's part. However, she claimed that it did not work as it ought to. Nathaniel determined the married women were wrong, and Thomasin was actually biologically female. She dressed in women's clothes and did women's work for John Atkins, who had acquired her contract. However, the married women were furious at being overruled, so they snuck in and observed Thomasin while she slept, and determined that she was biologically male. The following week, they were joined by several other women and John Atkins, who asked Thomasin about her gender. She said she had a hole, but upon John examining Thomasin, he determined that she was biologically male and asked Nathaniel to punish her for cross-dressing. Then more humiliation came when Thomasin was accosted by two men and forcefully examined. They determined that Thomasin was biologically male. Angry at the unrest and uncivilized behavior in the area, the Jamestown General Court decided to settle the matter once and for all. Thankfully, they declined to examine Thomasin, and instead heard testimony from her employer, John Atkins, as well as one of the men who accosted her. and subsequently reviewed Thomason's own description of her gender. They determined that Thomason was both biologically male and female, and ordered the publication of their ruling so there were no more inquiries. Thomason was ordered to wear both stereotypically male and female clothing to indicate their unique gender, and after that, they seemed to disappear from all historical records. While this may seem unsettling, it just means they didn't have any more legal troubles afterward. They likely lived a less dramatic life and were free to express themselves dually within their community. Nowadays, scholars generally agree that Thomason Hall was intersex, possessing physical characteristics of both a biological male and biological female. Intersex people were known throughout history, even worshipped, like the Greek god Hermaphroditus. So Thomason's identity may not have been all that strange in the general court, and their ruling accepted Thomason's identity, which was honestly the best outcome in that time period. Sailing across the Atlantic and through time to France, we meet Charlotte d'Eon de Beaumont, who was born in 1728 in rural France and assigned male at birth. Her family was noble but poor, so she had more freedom than most people in France, but needed a way to rise above her station. Thankfully, Charlotte was incredibly intelligent, and when she was 15 moved to Paris, later graduating from university with a degree in civil and canon law when she was 21. She began writing about financial and administrative matters in a publication, which quickly attracted the attention of high-ranking civil servants under Louis XV. This led to her being recruited into Secret du Roi, in English called the King's Secret, a network of personal spies hired by Louis XV without the government's knowledge. Additionally, she served as the secretary to the French embassy in Russia for 4 years from 1756 to 1760, during which time she was rumored to attend balls dressed as a woman. Shortly after returning to France, she became a captain of dragoons in the 7 Years' War and was injured in battle. The French government considered sending her back to Russia due to the death of the previous Russian empress, but ultimately, due to her service in the war and diplomatic skills, was sent to London to draft the Treaty of Paris, which was a treaty to end the 7 Years' War. Once the treaty was signed, she was awarded the Order of St. Louis, which granted her the title of Chevelaire. But it's here where things began to take a turn. Perhaps her new title bolstered Charlotte's ego, or she felt untouchable due to the fact she was a spy for Louis XV, as well as being a civil servant for the French government. Either way, she began enjoying her position in London a little too much, and began racking up huge amounts of debt. She also resumed her spying activities behind the French government's back. Because despite how unpopular and costly the 7 Years' War was, King Louis XV had no intention of maintaining peace and instead wanted to invade the United Kingdom. Eventually, a new French ambassador came to London and reminded Charlotte of her lowly place as a simple civil servant. Angry and embarrassed, she lashed out, refusing to return to France, and was thus cut off from her French pension. So naturally, she decided to make things even worse for herself by publishing some of the secret correspondence relating to her spying activities and publicly calling the new French ambassador unfit for their position. This lack of discretion was not only scandalous, it was horrifying to the wider public. Betraying the confidence of your own government, which you work for, because of a petty grievance was seen as deeply uncivil. Even worse, in an incredibly selfish act, Charlotte began blackmailing the French government with documents relating to the secret invasion plans. This would have plunged Europe back into another war and caused immense suffering among commoners. The French government had no choice but to negotiate with Charlotte, even as she became more unhinged and accused the French ambassador of attempting to murder her and sued him for it. When the ambassador countersued for libel and slander, Charlotte could not provide any evidence and went into hiding before eventually becoming just another eccentric political exile. During this time, she was seen purchasing women's clothing in London and encouraged rumors that she was actually a woman. Later, when King Louis XV died, King Louis XVI took the throne, and Charlotte once again tried to negotiate a return to France. This was when her gender identity began to be more than just a rumor. It was agreed that Charlotte would turn over all the remaining correspondence she possessed relating to her spying activities, and in exchange, she would be allowed to return to France and retain a small pension. She agreed, but not before demanding official recognition from the government as a woman. Charlotte claimed she was born biologically female and raised as a boy for her family's inheritance. It's likely the king knew this wasn't true, as he never ordered an examination, and simply agreed to her demands, and offered funds for a new wardrobe if she agreed to exclusively wear women's clothing, which she happily agreed to. With everything settled, Charlotte returned to France and was banished to her provincial hometown, probably so she could keep out of trouble. For 8 years, she lived a quiet life, except for publishing a greatly exaggerated memoir with the help of a ghostwriter. But living in rural France, away from big cities and high society, she longed to return to Great Britain, and was eventually allowed to return to London in 1785, which was just as well, considering the French Revolution began 4 years after that. Cut off from her pension, she was forced to sell her possessions, and her family's properties in France were seized. In 1791, she sat for a portrait, which was later copied and is now hanging in the National Portrait Gallery in London. Several prints were also made of her and her exploits, as she often tried to remain relevant in British and French society. One such example is when she wrote to France and offered to lead a group of exclusively female soldiers. But this offer was not taken seriously because Charlotte was at that time 64 years old. She also participated in fencing tournaments, but was forced to abandon this when she was injured. Things took an even worse turn when she went to debtor's prison, became paralyzed from a fall, and spent the last 4 years of her life bedridden and in severe debt, eventually dying at the age of 81 in 1810. The surgeon who examined her post-mortem stated that Charlotte was biologically male. Despite what people think about queer people in history constantly being persecuted or forced into hiding, there were quite a few exceptions. Charlotte was openly transgender in the 18th century, and her identity was accepted by some of the most famous historical figures of that period. For decades, people simply accepted Charlotte for who she was, and celebrated her achievements, intelligence, as well as her ability to draw attention. Now, join me as we travel to Rhode Island in 1752 to meet Jemima Wilkinson, who was born into a prominent Quaker family. From a young age, Jemima was athletic and excelled at horseback riding. She was also intelligent and could memorize long passages from the Bible. Sadly, her mother Amy died when Jemima was still a child, just after giving birth to her 12th child, leaving Jemima's father Jeremiah to raise the children on his own as he never remarried. They were part of the Society of Friends, also known as Quakers, a progressive branch of Christianity that believes in an inner light guiding their faith, and is usually known for being more accepting than other religions. Usually. When Jemima was in her early 20s, she started attending an offshoot of the Society of Friends, which emphasized more individual enlightenment. The Friends were not happy, and in 1776 they disavowed her from meetings. And since they were already giving her the boot, they decided to also get rid of her sister for having an illegitimate child. And 2 of her brothers were kicked out for beginning to train for military service as the American Revolution had just begun. This probably caused enormous stress, and when the winter weather came that year, Jemima contracted what is likely typhus. She was bedridden with an extremely high, prolonged fever for days. Her family and neighbors were expecting her death. Then, it suddenly broke, and Jemima awoke declaring her soul had ascended to heaven and had been transformed by God into public universal friend, who was tasked with preaching to others. Typhus is known to cause high fevers, sometimes high enough to cause brain damage. So it's possible the fever caused brain damage which triggered Friend's transformation. Fevers can also cause hallucinations, which can leave a lasting impact on the affected person. However, it's also possible that this near-death experience caused Friend to reevaluate their life and decide to either live their authentic self or transform into something in order to spread a message. Either way, they now proclaimed they were genderless and asked that gendered pronouns not be used in reference to them. When referring to them, people simply called them Public Universal Friend, the friend, or puff. They wore loose black robes and kept their hair loose and were described as moving easily and freely. The local Quakers did not believe Public Universal Friend's story and questioned their newfound faith. So the friend, accompanied by their brother and several sisters, began preaching in New England and Pennsylvania, advocating for gender equality and the abolishment of slavery. Their meetings were sometimes held outdoors, but they also borrowed meeting houses from other Quakers, called Free Quakers. These Quakers supported the American Revolution and appreciated the Friends family's involvement in the cause. Public Universal Friend never used a Bible, reciting verses by heart or speaking on matters that she felt were important. Many were fascinated by the Friend, and they attracted large audiences, some of whom began following Puff, calling themselves Universal Friends and forming the Society of Universal Friends. This society was radically different from the Quakers, as most were in their 20s and 30s, and the majority of them were women. Due to Puff's belief in gender equality, women held some of the most prominent roles in the Universal Friends, and they were often leaders in their community. Then, in the 1780s, Puff decided to establish a town in New York for the Society of Universal Friends where they could live without these stricter conventions of mainstream society. However, this was easier said than done, as local townspeople were frequently at odds with the Friends. This even accumulated into 2 men attempting to arrest Puff, but they were easily defeated by the woman living in Puff's home, whose zeal was so great they tore apart the men's clothing. The men, after numerous arrest attempts, finally agreed to let Puff appear before a judge to rule whether they were offending any laws with their preaching or newly established town. However, the judge couldn't find any evidence of laws being broken and seemed to like Puff, even inviting them to preach in court to those who attended. Sadly, for the last 20 years of their life, Public Universal Friend was in poor health, though they continued to preach until they died at the age of 66 in 1819. A meeting was held for them, and Puff was buried first in the cellar of their home, then later in an unmarked grave as they wished. Despite their simple passing, obituaries for Public Universal Friend appeared in newspapers across New England, and the Society of Universal Friends continued until the 1860s when most of the remaining Friends had passed themselves. Puff's home and the town still remain, and the Yates County History Center exhibits artifacts belonging to Puff and the Friends at their museums. To this day, it's unknown why Public Universal Friend decided to embark on this new path. Was it an effect of the fever, or were they simply embracing their true self? Either way, their society overwhelmingly accepted them, likely due to their pre-established religious roots. Quakers were, and still are, tolerant of people from diverse backgrounds and lifestyles, and they emphasized dressing and looking plain. By becoming non-binary, Friend and the people they preached to could focus on the message itself, rather than the person presenting it, something society seemed to just accept. And while acceptance of trailblazers such as Thomas and Hall, Charlotte Dion, and Public Universal Friend varied across different time periods and cultures, it's important to highlight their stories, and the stories of their peers, that not only embrace their identity, but encourage them to live as their authentic selves. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to uncover more hidden history, and until next time, stay curious, history heroes.